Hello, everyone. Welcome to Agora. This is the English podcast version of my Spanish speaking radio show. I'm your host, Gabriel Andrade, broadcasting from Maracaibo, Venezuela. Joining me on the other end of the line from Victoria, Canada, is Professor John Leslie. He is the author of many books on philosophy, and today we're going to be talking about extraterrestrial life. Hi, Professor. Welcome.
Thanks for having me on your program.
Now, back in the 1950s, the physicist Enrico Fermi wondered why, if the universe is so vast and apparently there is space for extraterrestrial intelligent life, we haven't made any contact with any other extraterrestrial civilization, and this is known as the Fermi paradox. And apparently there are many ways to solve it, but I wonder what your answer to that question might be.
I think the most likely answer to the question is that species quickly destroy themselves after they've developed high intelligence and industrial civilizations. They destroy themselves through war or pollution, something like that.
So would you say we are not the first intelligent civilization in the universe, but rather there have been prior civilizations that have destroyed themselves?
That's quite possible. The bit of the universe we can see actually has more stars than all the sand grains on the shores of all the oceans of the Earth. That's a tremendous number of stars. We would expect to see signs of life if somewhere near us there were life on some of those stars, but there may well be distant life. At this moment, there may be trillions of other civilizations just too far for us to see them.
Right, but now in the case that the other civilizations have become extinct, that does not seem like a very nice prospect for us, because apparently that's going to be our fate also. Is there any way to avoid that fate?
Well, get people to get serious about global warming and nuclear warfare and so on. Tell them to make sure that humans are the lucky species which get past what's known as the great filter, which may filter out people as soon as they get high intelligence.
Right. Now, what's this great filter about?
Well, since we don't see signs of extraterrestrials, it could be that it's very hard to get intelligent life in the first place, or it could be that when you get intelligent life, it's filtered out by things like warfare. I think you should look also at the first part. It may just be very, very difficult to get life at all, or any life which is more complicated than just simple bacteria. That, I think, should be taken very seriously.
Right. And what's your position? Do you think our Earth is very rare, and in that sense, to get the first few steps was the difficult part, or rather that to get to the intelligence part is the more difficult one?
I think both parts are very difficult. There's a very interesting general argument due to my friend Brandon Carter, who's a cosmologist and physicist. It says that if you're trying to solve a very difficult problem, getting out of a cell, you have to solve several combination locks, and you have to guess the right numbers for those locks. It could be very unlikely that you're going to get out of the cell at all, but probably you'll solve it, if you do solve it, about halfway through the possible time. And in fact, we've developed high intelligence about halfway through the possible time available to us. That's to say, the time when our Earth got sufficiently cold for intelligence to appear, and also before the sun had got red giant and destroyed us. So that's a very general argument, and Carter thinks that this is a reason for thinking that there's certainly no life in the galaxy. We'd have to look much further than our galaxy to find other life.
Right. Now, let's assume that indeed we are unique and that, getting the first phases of life was difficult and maybe even more difficult to get across the intelligence. Would that imply that somehow we were favored by a higher intelligence or anything of that sort?
I don't think so. Are you meaning that we be favored by God? Is that the sort of idea you have here?
Yes. Some sort of a teleology, and going back to the strong anthropic principle.
Well, I don't think it would be necessary to think that God especially favored us. If there were God, you'd think the natural thing to do would be to favor very large numbers of species. The philosopher Leibniz argued that God would try to produce intelligence everywhere, and this was one reason for looking even in drops of water and finding very complex life. And in fact, we do find complex life in drops of water, don't we? As the early developer of the microscope found out.
Right.
On this God business, I think one thing to bear in mind is that even if God is running the universe and has created us specially, if we destroy ourselves, God can simply create another universe and start again. He's meant to have lots of power to do that sort of thing.
Right, but there's also, I wonder what your opinion of this could be. There's also the version put forward by physicist Frank Tipler of the final anthropic principle. And he basically says, look, if there is an intelligence and he created the world, he would make sure that we would never disappear. Because, what would be the point of setting everything in order for there to be intelligent life and then eventually letting it die? Somehow we would have a guarantee that we'd be here for ages. What's your view of that position?
I think it's a possible position, but you could say that if you are a believer in God, that God has blessed an afterlife, and He's not particularly worried for life in this universe goes extinct. I think that Tipler's general point is much more interesting. He thinks that the intelligence is going to spread through the universe and will be able to maintain itself even at the last moments of a big collapse of the universe, a so-called big crunch. He thinks that even in the very last microseconds, there could be tremendously fast-moving processes which would process enormously much information, and we could make sure that humans or our descendants could be in charge of those processes. So that could be our lives going on. That's a very interesting argument. I, in fact, reviewed Tipler's book for the London Review of Books, I think it was, and I gave it a very nice review because it was such an interesting book. I highly recommend it.
Right. Now I want to touch on the issue of religion a bit further. Would religions need to review their systems of belief in the case that we make contact with extraterrestrial intelligent life?
Certainly, if we found that they were very intelligent and had not been visited by Jesus Christ or the equivalent, you might think that the Christian religion was wrong. That would be one way of looking at things. And in fact, one of the reasons that Giordano Bruno got into trouble with the church was that he thought that there was intelligent life all over the universe, and the church said, well, that would mean that Christ would have to be crucified endless times to save all these intelligent races.
Yeah, but I mean that's a very well-known argument. What you're saying that, and indeed Bruno died because of that. But I've seen recently some Catholic theologians trying to adjust and say, no, this would not destroy your faith because, well, maybe those species were born without original sin, and in that case they wouldn't need a savior. Or maybe God incarnated in some other form, not necessarily Jesus Christ, but let's say some incarnation in some extraterrestrial being in order to save them. I mean, it appears that they have many possibilities here of adjustment.
Well, that's always so with religion. It's always possible to adjust your position in endless different ways, and those would be some ways of adjusting it, yes.
All right. Now, I want to go back to real quick to the anthropic principle. Now, you've been saying that, our chances of us being here, being the lucky ones, are rather low. I mean, this probabilistic was not very likely to get across from inorganic matter to organic matter, from there to multicellular life, from there to intelligent life, and so forth. And here comes the basic question: why are we here? And throughout many years, you have tackled this issue in your books. Do you have any answer to this question? Why are we here? I mean, how come we hit the jackpot?
Well, there's two possible ways of tackling this. One way is to say that even if intelligent life only appears once, you have to find yourself where the intelligent life appears. That's known as observational self-selection. You are an observer. You must find yourself in a place where intelligent life appears. That's a general answer to the question. But then there's all sorts of specific answers. You can point to the fact that we are in a favorable galaxy, and we are in the right place by a star of the right sort, that the Earth is the right size, it has the right amount of water, not too much, not too little. It hasn't got too much carbon dioxide, so that it didn't go the way of Venus and suffer tremendous temperatures and so on. You can list a large number of factors, and you could say, well, it's very lucky that we have these things around. Of course, if they weren't around, we wouldn't be here. But we can point to all these individual things. They're interesting books out there. One of them, the book Rare Earth by Brownlee and Peter Ward, I found very interesting.
Right. And what about the claim that, okay, I mean, it appears that we are the lucky ones, although, as you well say, well, I mean, in order to observe that, we need to be the lucky ones because of the observer selection effect. But many scientists and philosophers have claimed, well, but even if we had other constants of the universes, well, maybe life would have risen anyway, perhaps in some other form. I mean, we shouldn't be making the mistake of thinking that this is the only possible life form that there is. Maybe if we have different physical constants, well, other forms of life would have adapted to those physical constants. Do you see that as plausible?
I see it as certainly possible. I think it may be unlikely because there are some constants which require enormous fine-tuning in order to get life. The most dramatic case is the so-called cosmological constant, and it appears that needs a degree of tuning which is as accurate as throwing a dart to hit a target smaller than a grain of dust, and the target is placed at the far side of the visible universe. That's how accurately that particular constant seems to have been tuned. And that's the reason for thinking that you'd have to have a very lucky universe, even if the constants were randomized and you had large numbers of universes. It would still be only the very, very rare universe which would have life.
Right. Now, in the case that we do find extraterrestrial life, what do you think they would look like, and what would be their behavior? I mean, do we have any clue as to what their appearance could be? Can we assume that they would have extremities, that they would have 2 legs and 2 arms and a head and so on?
I think it would be very risky to assume these things, but there are fairly strong arguments for thinking that something like a head with eyes on and a mouth near the eyes and so on would be very useful, and it would be very useful to have movable arms. It could, though, be arms like those of an octopus, so you could get large numbers of arms.
And what about behavior? Should we expect aggressiveness from their part? I mean, I know physicist Stephen Hawking has warned that perhaps if they contact us, they could be conquerors, and the effects on us would be very similar to the effects of colonialism, like when the Spaniards came and they conquered the Indians. Are we to fear extraterrestrials?
I think you could see aggressiveness as something which helps a species to spread, but you could also see aggressiveness as something which would destroy a species before it spread, as they would have done themselves in with nuclear warfare or something like that. Stephen Hawking also has recently come out saying that we should be very careful about developing high intelligence machines because they might replace us. So you have to take into account the possibility that the aliens who are invading Earth will not be biological organisms. They will instead be advanced computers which are intelligent.
Right. Now, and politically, there is a lot of debate about whether or not big governments, such as the United States of America, but other, European powers and maybe Japan, whether or not they should spend money on the search for extraterrestrial intelligence. I mean, it seems like we have some rather urgent needs to take care of, like world hunger or diseases and so on, and that we shouldn't spend those resources on the search of extraterrestrial life. That a lot of people are saying that this is a major waste of money. What's your take on that?
I think that, in fact, you could boost the search for extraterrestrials enormously with a tiny, tiny fraction of the amount of money which is being spent on warfare. And I think that even in a few blockbuster films using up more money than would be used for this. One of the reasons for looking for extraterrestrials is the hope that we might get some message from them which tells us how to save ourselves. Of course, the message would be a general message which was being broadcast to all possible places, saying that the best way to save yourself is, for example, not to go in for experiments of very high energies, something like that.
Right.
This is very useful information.
Of course. I want to go back real quick to the issue of the Great Filter, because this is a very puzzling thing. Now, some philosophers, and I can think here of Nick Bostrom, they have argued that if the Great Filter is behind us, that is to say, if the difficult part was going from inorganic matter to organic matter, or from single-cell life to multicellular life, if the Great Filter is behind us, that should be good news for us, because that means that none of the other civilizations went past, and instead we did go back. We did go past, and in that case, well, we shouldn't expect to find extraterrestrial life. But if in the case that we found extraterrestrial life, that would mean that the Great Filter is ahead of us, and in that case, that would be good news for us, because that would mean that we still have a Great Filter to go for, and we might not pass it. We may become extinct. Do you agree with that line of reasoning?
I think that it has some force. In this area, you're so much groping in the dark that it's useful to pick up arguments which have force, but it's certainly it hasn't got conclusive force. I think one thing to bear in mind here is that if it's very easy to colonize a galaxy once you've developed high intelligence, we would expect to find ourselves in a species which had colonized the galaxy. And we certainly don't find ourselves there. And this is enough to make us think that probably it's very hard to develop high intelligence, very hard once you've got it to spread through the galaxy, and we may be facing some disaster in the near future.
Well, but couldn't that be that it's because we're still in the early stages? I mean, there's no reason to assume, apparently, that in the future we won't be able to colonize the galaxy. I mean, it's very much as the same as a kid wondering why still he doesn't have a job. Well, I mean, he should reason that this kid doesn't have a job yet because he's too young, but in the future he will.
I think that argument falls down because if you do manage to colonize the galaxy, there's so many more observers out there, and if that's the likely place for an observer to be, then you should expect that you are in that place, that you won't be the very among the very early people in the galaxy before galactic colonization has taken place. This is an argument which Nick Bostrom would I think accept. He has a book on in this area, and this is one of the arguments he takes very seriously.
Right. So would you agree with him that discovering extraterrestrial intelligent life would not be good news for us?
I think it would be good news in some ways and bad news in other ways.
All right.
We're dealing with philosophy here as well as with science, and I must say that I don't trust most philosophical arguments, although I'm a philosopher. They sort of work half the time.
Right. Well, Professor John Leslie, thank you so much for taking. Hello, everyone. Welcome to Agora. This is the English podcast version of my Spanish-speaking radio show. I'm your host, Gabriel Andrade, broadcasting from Maracaibo, Venezuela.